Hello and thanks for watching another edition of ARFCOM News. If you're not getting notifications for us, that's because YouTube sucks. And no matter what you do, our robot overlords know what you want better than you do. Spoiler, it's Jimmy Fallon. You want to watch Jimmy Fallon. But even though the Tube Utes won't send you notifications, just remember we publish the same time every Friday morning. We're more dependable than that one person who is definitely going to reply all to the whole distro if you don't send the email BCC. This week we've got dissolving the NRA, Minneapolis police pro tips on crime, and how to get away with carrying a gun in California stand. But before we do, let's hear from the people who paid for this whole operation. If you like seeing stuff more than not seeing stuff, take a look at our sponsor, TNVC.com, your source for quality night vision gear to make you the bump in the night. Hey, did you see my special report on Biden's ban plan a couple of days ago? Critics say Biden's plan is a pile of literal garbage. If you didn't catch it, be sure to take a look when this video is finished. We do a deep dive with full analysis of each bullet point on his plan to undermine Second Amendment rights in the US and why almost every word is just a bucket full of garbage squeezins and shower drain hair. Link in the doobly-doo, of course. May as well get this party started with a big story last week. The NRA is being dismantled, or something. The New York Attorney General Letitia James has filed a lawsuit in an attempt to dissolve the NRA because the NRA is registered in New York, which kind of explains some stuff if you think about it. As a 501c4 charity, the NRA is legally required to act in the best interests of its members to perform its charitable mission. The suit alleges all manner of corruption within the NRA, which is no surprise, but the suit alleges that millions were squandered, that senior leadership used organization funds for personal benefit, and that the organization has failed to uphold its fiduciary responsibility to its members. James said, the NRA's influence has been so powerful that the organization went unchecked for decades while top executives funneled millions into their own pockets. The main focus of the lawsuit is on Wayne LaPierre and 3 top execs. The suit seeks to dissolve the NRA, dismiss LaPierre and the other 3, and this is my favorite part, force them to pay back members for the misuse of funds. The NRA responded to the suit by calling it a baseless, premeditated attack on our organization and the Second Amendment freedoms it fights to defend. Of course, the NRA plans to mount a vigorous defense of the suit, which will cost members even more, but I haven't heard anything on how much LaPierre plans to kick in on the legal costs. For my part, I have mixed feelings, as I've had since the corruption in the NRA first started coming to light a few years ago. On the one hand, I despise corruption in any context, and nothing gets me angrier than powerful people with no fear of consequence. So in that regard, the NRA, or at least senior leadership, may deserve what it gets, if these allegations are indeed true. On the other hand, the NRA has been the largest gun rights organization for, well, ever. Even if you want to criticize them for being less of a street fighter than other organizations, you can't just dismiss out of hand their contributions to gun safety, hunter education, and landmark legal opinions like Heller and McDonald. Even if you want to claim the NRA is no longer willing to engage in fights like that, you can't deny the cover that they give to other gun rights organizations. Most authoritarian control freaks have never even heard of the GOA, SAF, FPC, or many other worthy organizations. If I knew with certainty that some of those other organizations would get every dollar the NRA is getting now, if I knew that people wouldn't stop donating entirely and would instead just donate to another gun rights advocacy group, I would probably be right there with those of you chanting, "Burn, baby, burn." But I don't have any reason to expect that to be the case. If the NRA is dissolved, maybe it does deserve it, but it will leave a vacuum behind. It will have profound effects on gun rights and politics in general. Don't touch me, man! And to be perfectly frank, the NRA spends truckloads of money to get certain politicians elected. It's hard not to see that as the real reason for this suit. Regardless of the outcome of the case, we are likely to see evidence presented that exposes some of the most intimate details of the business conducted by senior leadership. If the NRA survives this lawsuit as an organization, I hope the board conducts a complete purge of leadership positions. And if you find yourself complaining about the NRA often, maybe you should join them so you can vote. Let's move on to Minneapolis, Minnesota. The very departments that have been the focus of calls to defund, and no, I am absolutely not diving into that issue here, have been hemorrhaging officers, and at the same time, criminals seem not to have received the memo that due to reduced staffing, all crime will have to take place more slowly. Gunfire reports are up by 224%. So, in the midst of all this, the Minneapolis PD issued some instructions for criming safely. If you take a close look at the list of instructions, you'll note that it doesn't say anything about staying strapped or about getting clapped. Don't get me wrong, the tips given by the Minneapolis police are reasonable and should result in the highest probability of survival. And even if you're carrying a gun, you should still probably follow them, mostly. Is it fair to assume the victim of a crime is almost always behind the OODA loop and therefore at extreme disadvantage? Might they lose even if they are armed? Sure. Might they decide their best chance of survival is not to draw sometimes? Of course. If a man is pointing a gun at you, demanding money, you comply until and unless an opportunity presents itself. Because it's not a movie, and if someone is close and has a weapon drawn, you are not likely to be able to get a CNS hit before they can seriously injure you. And that is what it takes to stop a person before they can inflict a wound. Because even if you zap them several times, that'll give you cold comfort if you didn't survive the encounter. So it's safer to comply until 1, the encounter is over and you have to replace your phone, but you're not leaking. B, you are convinced that you have a safe opportunity to draw, or thirdly, they attack you. At that point, there is no decision to make. You are in a fight now, and it's time to fight back. You'll probably be cut, stabbed, or shot, and you need to give more than you get, faster than you're getting it, and give it well enough to stop your attacker. But having the gun gives you a choice that you wouldn't have otherwise. It allows you to be the master of your destiny in the manner God intended. Win or lose, a gun gives you the freedom to choose resistance. Estimates on the rate of DGU vary widely, partly because each study attacks the question in a completely different manner. If you aren't counting any of the times somebody pulled a gun but didn't have to shoot, or if you aren't even attempting to account for all the incidents that weren't reported to police, then you're definitely not getting an accurate picture. But it seems reasonable the overwhelming majority of DGU are resolved simply by displaying the intent to use a weapon. And counting only the instances where a crime was stopped ignores the deterrent effect of some unknown random sampling of the population being armed. Obviously, it's impossible to measure all the crimes that didn't happen because somebody didn't want to get shot doing it, but criminals surveyed in prison tended to be more fearful of being shot by their victim than being arrested by police. All in all, being armed reduces risk to the individual at the same time as it reduces the overall rate of violent crime. So why is the list of advice all about being a good victim with no mention of resisting criminals? Post your conspiracy theories below. Extra points if you involve chemtrails and fluoride. But regardless of whether the MPD thinks you ought to be carrying a gun, at least that's a choice available to you in Minnesota. If you live in California, you may have simply resigned yourself to never being able to carry a gun. But that's only because you don't fish enough. California is a may-issue state. That means there is a concealed carry permit process, but approval is entirely discretionary and dependent on the whims of the county sheriff. It can also cost almost $500. In practical terms, that discretionary part means wealthy and privileged people have no difficulty finding the Crown's pleasure for themselves or for their private guard, but regular folks in LA or San Francisco counties are never, ever issued a permit, while people in more rural areas might be issued a permit. While it remains in place, though, there are few options for a person to carry a gun legally, and that brings us back around to fishing. According to the relevant statute, a valid exception to the offense of carrying a concealable weapon is being engaged in fishing or traveling to or from fishing so long as it is unloaded. That means that if you have a valid fishing license and you keep a pole in your car, you could decide to drive to your favorite fishing spot anytime you wish. Once you arrive, you can load and carry your gun, but on the way there, you can still carry it unloaded and concealed, which is something that would normally be illegal. This is probably a really good point to remind people that if you are taking legal advice from some layman on the internet, then you are an absolute imbecile. So don't blame me if you get arrested anyway. In fact, I think that if you attempt to use this loophole, there is a really good chance you'll be arrested and booked by any officer who doesn't know better and doesn't really care to find out. The old saying of you may beat the charge, but you won't beat the ride definitely applies here. Speaking of carrying guns, remember when thousands of armed voters showed up with a guillotine to protest Governor Blackface's oppressive gun control policies in Virginia? That made such an impression on Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, they didn't heed the warning whatsoever and are now introducing federal legislation to mirror racist Ralphie's laundry list of authoritarian control freak nonsense. Or at least the parts that Northam managed to get past anyway. They ditched the loser issues, which does make sense, I suppose. Or it would from the perspective that bills that passed in Virginia might plausibly have the best chance of passing at the federal level. Except I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that no gun control has much chance of passing out of committee right now in the Senate. As milquetoast as politicians are about this stuff, the red team controls the Senate. Barely. And the last thing a Republican senator wants is to have any association with Biden or Governor Blackface. That's no reason to give them any breathing room, though. Keep the pressure on them. Pause the video right now and call 202-224-3121. The Capitol switchboard operator will connect you with your senator. If you live outside the U.S., pick one. Just because you aren't a citizen doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. But vote early and vote often. Tell them you oppose the Virginia plan to reduce Gun Violence Act of 2020 and you oppose gun control legislation in general. If you believe your senator is reasonably, generally pro-gun, tell them gun rights are more important to you than any other issue, and that is the sole reason you voted for them. Explain that you have no reservations voting against them should they show the slightest weakness on that issue. On the other hand, if your senator is an authoritarian control freak, don't let that be the reason you keep silent. Tell them you plan to vote against them in the next election because of their support for bills like this. As always, be concise and be courteous to the person taking the call. He or she may not be opposed to gun rights, and even if they are, berating them won't change their mind. Don't put that phone away, or anyway, I mean, you're probably watching this on a phone, but what I mean is get ready to call politicritters in California as well. The micro-stamping law they passed in 2007 has been through a variety of legal challenges, but was ultimately upheld by the California Supreme Court. Manufacturers have stated it is impossible to stamp in two places and haven't bothered to attempt to comply with the law. So, shooters haven't had access to any new handgun designs. At least, mere plebes haven't anyway. Organs of the state are always immune from such laws, of course, because some animals are more equal than others. It's a bad law. It's a stupid law for, like, so many reasons. Most of them being a long list of reasons it just can't work. Micro-stamped numbers aren't always legible on a brand new gun, but the more you shoot, the more the stamp wears until it is totally useless just by normal use over time. Unless you're a criming crook, that is, and you just sand or file off the numbers in the first place. Or the sneaky crime person can pick up a few empties at the range and sprinkle them around the crime scene, implicating some innocent person and wasting department resources. Or they could use a gun that was made long before any of this nonsense. Or they could build their own, because guns aren't some kind of dark sorcery. They're pretty easy to make. Or they could just smuggle their AKs from Mexico like normal criminals. I really don't have time to delve into all the reasons this law is just stupid, or at least it would be if the real intent was safety as they claim, but if that was the case, why would they exempt law enforcement? If nothing else, this not unsafe list exposes law enforcement agencies to some legal liability for using handguns that are not on the not unsafe list. And who wants cops to be running around with not unsafe guns? But none of that is the actual news. The reason this is making the news again is that the California legislature is considering a bill that would amend the law so stamping is only required in one place. That might sound like good news, but it really isn't. The California Supreme Court found they couldn't repeal the law just because it was impossible to comply with, but federal courts might view it as a de facto ban, which obviously runs afoul of DC versus Heller. So by making it less impossible, it might make it more legally defensible. The new law also has the provision that each new handgun added to the list means 3 other handguns that don't meet the new standard would have to be removed from the list. I literally have no idea how they would determine which guns those would be. Just the very idea of this list is offensive to liberty. And the new law still has all the problems the old law had. So go to legislature.ca.gov/your_legislator.html to find your representatives or pick a politician to chat with. Just because you aren't a subject of Californistan doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. Tell them you oppose AB 2847, and if they express anything but stalwart resistance to it, you will oppose their candidacy as well. Today's secret phrase is John has a long mustache. First person to post John has a long mustache in the YouTube comments gets a free shirt from our Teespring store. H und K, because you suck. Und we hate you. The Space Kraut Magic firm that brought you the MP5 is changing ownership. Kind of. They were publicly traded, and they're still publicly traded, but one of the minority shareholders has acquired a majority stake in the company, so HK is now owned by this thoroughly European word salad that I won't even attempt to pronounce. That's good for them, I suppose, because HK was actually profitable last year for the first time in years. I don't know enough to speculate, even wildly, about what effect this will have on HK's apathy toward American consumers, but I know some fanboys are going to be stoked about the release of the SP5K PDW. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the features, but I will say I think HK was a little tone deaf on this one. They heard that American consumers wanted to buy a clone of the tiny submachine gun from like every 80s action movie ever, but they seem to have just tossed together some of the parts they had on the shelf. I'm sure they're fine guns, but by and large, I don't think most people want one of these little blasters for practical reasons. The MP5 is indeed a fine gun, and while it would certainly be adequate for the job of home or maybe vehicle defense, the ergos are absolute trash. People who want a fighting PDW are more likely to buy one of the more modern options. People who buy this want to dress up in gray sweats and tell Hans they have a machine gun. That is, people buying the SP5K PDW want a semi-auto clone of the MP5K that's as close as possible to the original, including the diopter sight. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And finally, a glimmer of hope in the endless wasteland of the ammo shortage. Fiocchi is going to spin up a new factory in Arkansas. Fiocchi has been importing good, clean, dependable ammo into the US for decades, and most of their offerings are quite reasonably priced. The new facilities are expected to cost $15 million, but positioning production here in the US ought to save literal boatloads of shipping and customs costs. Hopefully that means we'll be able to build our ammo forts without burning holes in our wallets. Well, dear viewer, that's the end of the line for this train. I hope you enjoy watching these videos nearly as much as I enjoy making them. If you'd like to help us keep doing it, please consider supporting our sponsor, tnvc.com, your source for all the tools you need to be the bump in the night. And if you skip to the end of this video just to get to the secret phrase, you're gonna be super disappointed because you'll have to go back and watch the video to find it. I love you.